Here we go. Zach Bitter, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Jason, thanks for having me back on. Looking forward to it.
So, I'm very appreciative of your time, Zach. I've managed to wrangle you in this weird Twilight Zone week between Christmas and New Year's. So, thank you very much. And especially because we are 10 days out from a recent 100-mile PR attempt that you had. You were hoping to run under 11:19 on a track for 100 miles. Man, you are built different, my friend. Let us know how you're feeling.
Yeah, no, I feel pretty good at this point. I probably did a little bit less damage getting off the track sooner than I would have if I had fully gone the 100-mile distance and duration. But I think kind of looking back on it in hindsight, the where I think I maybe went wrong with the entire process was I drew out what I like to call kind of the ultra marathon long run development phase of training, which is the stretch of time I spend at the end of a training cycle, peaking for an A race, where I'm really moving a lot of my training load and focus towards race specific stuff. So it ends up being a lot of volume, a lot of kind of zone two, lower end of zone three type of work, and a lot of kind of race environment and race intensity type practice. And it's one of those things where, if you draw it out a little too long, you just end up a little bit overextended going into the race, and then you kind of find that out midway through the race. Not something unfamiliar to other distances. I think you have that same thing, but it's also one of those things you don't have to necessarily know until you put yourself in that environment of, okay, now I'm going to really push myself to the limit here versus stop a little bit before that in training in most cases. So in hindsight, that's kind of what I'm looking at with it. I think just going into that phase of training with doing the equalizer 12-hour at the end of October, I did kind of the first phase of a two-phase block of training specific to that stuff, and then tried to do phase two in between those two races. And yeah, I think I just kind of strung it out a little bit longer than it needed to be. So heading into off season now, so I'm kind of resetting, and then I'll get back to some more kind of traditional training inputs that people are probably more familiar with before going back to doing another 100-mile kind of ultra specific long run development phase later in 2026.
Zach, I think it's a little comforting for all of us to hear that even at the elite world class level, you don't always get your training right, and you go into a big goal race a little bit overcooked, a little bit past your prime, past your sell by date. I think it would be really helpful to dig into some of the specifics on why you felt like you were a little bit overcooked. Is this too much specific work, too much intensity, however you might define that, too much volume? How do you think about how you were feeling on race day and the training decisions that led to how you felt?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the way I like to do this is I usually treat like a full training cycle as about a 6-month process. So when this one began, it was right around mid-year, and I was just coming off an Achilles tendon issue that sort of sidelined me from running for about 4 weeks, and then I had another roughly 4 where I was sort of building back up to traditional running volume and getting to a spot where I could realistically think about timelines with races. And the way I looked at it was I hadn't run a 100-miler in over a year at that point, so I wanted to try to do a 100-miler at maybe a little bit less than a PR effort to just kind of reintroduce myself to everything that goes into that sort of stuff. I was also juggling a few new things going into this training cycle. One being I revamped my nutrition approach to try to get to a point where I could tolerate some of these higher amount of carbohydrate intakes during the race itself. And then just structurally, the way I trained for it was slightly different in that I did my first full training cycle for an ultra marathon where I had a biking component that was actually built in a structured manner versus just being something I would plug in periodically as a way to reduce some impact or navigate a small like injury or something that was like impact related that I wanted to give a little bit of a break from. There were just some moving parts that I felt like having a actual race experience before taking a full swing at a PR would be valuable. And all of that went really well. I had a training block going into the Equalizer 12-hour, which was October 25th, just so people have a kind of an idea of the timeline. That was definitely my best training block since moving to Austin 4 years ago. I just had 3 weeks where I sort of had these ranges of what I wanted to hit between kind of a low end and a high end. And I was getting to the high end and almost wanting more. So that had me really excited as to where like my fitness was actually at and how things were progressing and the inputs were working and things like that. And then Equalizer went quite well. I ran 11:48 for 100 miles there. And that course was a 2-mile loop that was very fast relative to what you're going to typically find in ultra marathons, but not quite as fast as what you're probably going to get on a track like at Desert Solstice. If I had to estimate, I would say that 2-mile loop probably was maybe 10, at most 15 minutes slower than what you're going to get with just the pancake flat entire consistency you get running around a 400-meter high school loop or high school track loop. So I was really excited kind of about where things were at that point. I did a little bit of a reset for about a week or two after that, and then sort of ramped back up for that next phase of what that next ultra long run block of training was going to look like going into Solstice. So after that, I was still optimistic. I didn't really see anything in that block of training that suggested, all right, you're kind of going in a little bit overcooked. But I did have one setback where I got a little sick, which I think seems like everyone's gotten some version of this over the last like couple months of just, some sort of like maybe virus or upper respiratory issue. So that was like a little bit of a hurdle I had to get over at one point in that, but it wasn't anything like super substantial or lingering around so long that I felt like it was impacting things on race day or anything like that. But when I got to the race itself, I started noticing at right around maybe 20, 30 miles that things were getting a little bit more difficult than I'd like them to be. Targeting kind of the paces would be required for a PR. And at first you always just kind of think, okay, there's going to be some ebb and flow through this race in terms of like you have your high points and your low points, and you're better off not overreading into those too early because a lot of times they just pass. And it can also be something on a track that tend to spiral really quickly. So I try not to respond to anything too aggressively, but that kind of progressed and just kind of got worse all the way through 40 miles. And then when I was getting closer to 48, it just was kind of something that was progressively getting worse versus coming back and forth in terms of how I was feeling. And at that point, I think I recognized that I had just like overextended things a little bit. Legs were feeling heavy. Motivation was a degree lower than it should have been at that point. So I like to look at it through that lens. It's like, how's my body feeling? How's my mind feeling? How excited am I actually to be out here? And usually if I kind of overextend a specific element of training, those are the things that tend to linger behind a little bit, especially the motivation side of things where, you really have to want to be on a track. And if you find yourself in a spot where you've sort of done too much of that aspect of training to the degree where no longer you don't have that drive to maybe feel like you want to be out there enough to chase the goal you have on the table, it gets just progressively more difficult. And I haven't found a way to really navigate that in a way other than saying, okay, I need to just take a break from this for a little bit of time, reset, and then come back with a refreshed version of that excitement and motivation to chase a target like that. So I've been doing this for a while, so that wasn't like a new experience for me. I had a similar experience in 2017 where I had a really good training cycle, had a pretty decent 100-mile earlier in the year, and then actually Desert Solstice was the race I was trying to do at the end of the year and had almost the exact same scenario, except for I made it a few miles further that year. But everything kind of checked the same boxes in terms of just like, okay, I kind of see what's going on here. It can be a hard one to kind of digest too, because like, especially in like the ultra running community, I think we oftentimes think of ourselves as like really strong-willed and able to persevere. And to some degree, that is the skill set required to really kind of get through the highs and lows of a race. But we're all still going to have that same variance between optimal and suboptimal. And if you do what I did and kind of overextend a phase of training to the degree where you end up on the suboptimal side of that, you're just going to be less likely to be able to navigate that when the going gets tough. So that's kind of where I found myself, I think, this time around. But if I back up and think of it just in a whole, the 6 month training cycle altogether was about as good as I've had since moving to Austin, and on par with some of my best training cycles, minus not having a home run race at the end of it or anything like that. So for me, I think being able to stack this one on top of more training cycles that don't have an injury interruption or a forced off-season interruption due to some sort of injury or something like that will be kind of a useful thing to build off of heading into next year and hopefully more seasons and cycles after that.
Yeah, Zach, let's put your 100-mile race pace into context. You're trying to run, or you were trying to run under 11 hours and 19 minutes. What is that per mile?
Yeah, so that ends up being like, so 647.5 is like the exact pace I hit for my PR. So I
It's like a
think on
2:58 marathon, basically.
pretty, yeah, it's right
Four in a
around
row.
that, just under sub 3 hour. Yeah, and it gets interesting because it's not continuous running. There's going to be some stopping in most cases. I think when I ran my fastest, that 11:19, I think I stopped for maybe 3.5 minutes with just a couple of bathroom breaks. Then you get like some additional distance just from going into lanes 2 and 3. You're never the only person on the track, and oftentimes people are doing things that are longer and slower than what I'm doing out there. So you end up probably needing a moving pace of closer to like 640 to get to the pacing that I hit with my fastest time. So I usually go into these things assuming I'm going to need to be running somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to maybe 10 seconds per mile faster when I'm actually running to accommodate a couple bathroom stops, some additional distance that you're going to get from weaving out of lane 1 from time to time. And then you just kind of hope for the best at that point.
Wow, that really does put it into perspective. Really incredible to think about you doing that for that many hours on a track. Yeah, I am really fascinated by this idea of sort of getting a little bit burned out at the end of a season. With my experience running track and cross country, I have definitely been there where you just don't even really want to race at the end of the season. We used to say you're fried.
Yeah.
You're toast. And, it's not an injury. It's not really overtraining syndrome, like the real formal definition of that. I tend to put it in this other category of burnout. It's not yet at the level of overtraining syndrome, but you're getting past this, peak performance level where, you can only stay at that peak performance level for a certain period of time. Most of your time is either building to it or then recovering from that peak race. So it's almost like you didn't get the timing right of where you wanted to be on that peak performance level. How do you think about this issue? Because this is one of the hardest things that I found, with coaching, just with communication and education around the sport is, what this feeling actually is at the end of the season and how to maybe plan against it for a future season.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, when I look back on this particular experience for myself, I think where I went wrong was, or I mean, maybe the way to look at it is there's maybe a couple things I could have done differently to have mitigated that. And one would have been maybe removing the physical and mental load of that first 100 mile or tune-up race may have given me the physical and mental bandwidth to sort of get to the desert solstice time frame feeling a little bit more in the right spot. That's easy to say that in hindsight because I ended up going into that race and the things that I thought I was going to need practice with actually went quite well. So it wasn't something I probably actually ended up needing in hindsight. I could have probably gotten away with a shorter race just to get sort of the race day atmosphere, but maybe not the 100 mile mental and physical fatigue that you're going to get even from a race where you're not necessarily looking to wring yourself as dry as you are for like a PR attempt. So that was maybe one way to look at it. Another way to look at it would have been just, I may have just gotten a little bit unlucky in terms of that first block of training that I did with the ultra specific stuff went better than expected. So perhaps I needed less of that for a second time. I did pull back a little bit on what I ended up hitting in comparison, but maybe not quite enough in between those two events. So um, that could be it. The hard part is, I think, to some degree, it is part of the game where you don't know for sure. And that's what makes it kind of exciting, because race day, you're kind of going out and you're trying to figure some of that stuff out or learn from some of those experiences so that you start to draw a personal timeline that is going to be a little bit more predictable for you at the individual level going forward. So for me, like, the way I think about this now is if I'm going to put a PR 100-mile attempt on the calendar, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious around proximity to other races that are of that same distance and duration, or just be a little bit more just trust that I can do a little bit of a shorter ultra marathon peaking phase going into it, and still feel like I have the tools that I need that from a specific standpoint to get there. And I think some of that is easier now that I've gotten answers to some of the questions that went into this training cycle, not having the answers to. So there's probably a little more trust in being able to do that this next time around. So I think a lot of it does come down to just experience and trust in the stuff that's working and the stuff that you have learned works, and you don't necessarily need to spend more time and energy fine tuning them any further.
Yeah, and I think a good lesson here is, if you're getting those signals that you're in really, really good shape, you probably do need a little bit less of the really specific work that has the potential to overcook you just a little bit. But there is one thing that you said on social media that I wanted to dig into that I think is such a great example of a positive mindset around coming up short on a goal that you have. You said, I'll reset and look to 2026 to extract the value from that training cycle. I love that sentence, Zach. Absolutely beautiful. I mean, first of all, it's positive. Second of all, I think you're hinting that just because you didn't have that PR race at the end of the season that you were hoping for, it's not like the season was wasted. You still built all that fitness, you still got in all that work. Are you saying that there's still value in all those months of hard work, even if you didn't run a good time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially when you come out unscathed and don't have to take unforced time off outside of what you would typically have between training cycles. So, and I look at my own experience running with this too, where I tend to be my strongest, not when I have one really good training cycle, but when I stack a few good, consistent ones on top of one another. And I have the necessary breaks built in, but they're maybe a little on the shorter side because I'm not trying to navigate an injury or something, where, kind of like what you were saying before, there's a difference between just peaking a little bit early and then kind of be cresting down that peak performance and then missing on race day, versus like bull rushing through that and continuing to hammer. So in a scenario there would be like, okay, I had this bad race, and go sign up for another one 4 weeks later, hoping you're going to get a different outcome by just pushing it off and continuing down that same path that was already starting to trend downward. So I think it's just like kind of the macro sense of training load and development over time, where it's really easy to look at a single block of training leading into a race when someone nails it and think, okay, what did they do there that worked? I remember when Kipchoge broke the world record for the marathon, it was a big topic on like, what did he do for his training? And that stuff is interesting and fun to look at, because there is some value in looking at that. But the more interesting thing is, what did he do for the last 10 plus years to get himself to a point where all of a sudden that sort of a time and world record was on the table for him? Because that's probably going to tell you more about what is going to be required to progress over a long period of time than any 10 or 12 week phase of training. So I always like to zoom out with that sort of stuff and think like, okay, where am I in that sort of rotation of being able to stack, a couple or multiple training cycles that are very high caliber or high quality relative to what I can expect to do. And that usually lends myself to be able to trust being able to take bigger swings like PRs and things like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, running is so cumulative. It just builds on itself as you are excuse me, as you are consistent, as you kind of progress your running career. So like, yeah, if a runner has a really good, say, half marathon or marathon, I'm almost less interested in the 3 months that happened right before it and more in the 18 months that happened before that great performance. I always talk about this concept called the season before the season, which is exactly what you just described. If you want to have a breakthrough, it's often important to have two good training cycles, not just that one really productive cycle leading up to that goal race. So Zach, what kind of advice would you have for someone who had a similar experience? They had a big goal race. Maybe it wasn't 100 miles on a track shooting for an American record, but it's a marathon. It's a 5K. No matter what it is, they fell short of their goal. What are some productive ways of navigating that failure?
Hmm. Yeah, the way I like to look at this is you can't accidentally run a good race. If you run a good race, then you are doing things right and you got the result for it. But you can have a bad race with a lot of good training. So when you're in that situation where you've had the less than ideal or bad race, it's best to kind of think of that, okay, that's one data input that things didn't go well for. So it's okay to ask questions as to why that is. It's good to dig into why that may be, kind of like what we've been doing here. But it's also good to look at, well, what did I do holistically that also worked and went well that I want to make sure I don't throw out when I kind of go back to the drawing board and build up for the next one. So for me, it's like looking at it through the lens of when I went through the starting phase of this training, what were some inputs that I felt were really good movers that got me to a point where I was confident enough to try to put a PR attempt on the schedule in the first place, and make sure that I'm using those as kind of scaffolding points towards how I'm going to build up again, because I don't want to necessarily stop doing the things that are working well. So for me, it was like having a structured biking component in training during like the phases where I might be loading a little heavier on like short interval sessions and long interval sessions and things like that, or as I'm ramping back up to get to peak running volume, just to make sure I don't pick up any overuse injuries or things that could flare up from that restart process as you're kind of adding more volume to your training early on in a training phase. Or just looking at just the data as specific to different workouts, like were you doing workouts consistently where you're hitting the paces you needed to hit, or exceeding them from historical data and things like that. So when you go through all that stuff, it's a little bit easier to see like the multitude of data points that you can look at through a positive lens if they went well, versus thinking all of it was negative just because that end race didn't showcase where your fitness was potentially at the time. So I really think that's the best time to kind of reflect on that stuff. And some of that's just kind of tracking your training history in a good enough way where you have access to that data and can kind of look back at it and see where things went really well and what you want to make sure gets rinsed in again so you can progress further from the time before.
Yeah, I've come to the conclusion that I think good runners have to be good detectives. Whether it's an injury, a bad performance, even a really great performance, you have to then kind of be the detective, go back into your training and look at, what was really helpful for me, what might have contributed to this injury, this poor performance, or this great performance, and understanding all the inputs that go into an injury or a certain performance can be really helpful at you figuring out what is working for you, what isn't working for you, and what's leading to these kinds of outcomes. So I like that way of looking at the past, looking for clues that help you figure out, why you're where you're at. And that could be in a good place, or it could be in a place that you don't really like being. So I think that's a really valuable perspective. And also it's just one of these perspectives that you can apply to so many different scenarios, whether that's a good race, a bad race, or the injury, or any other scenario where you want to learn a little bit more about why something happened. I
Hmm.
do want to talk a little bit about your fueling approach, because you have historically been a lower carbohydrate runner. I'm not fully versed in your background with fueling. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of your approach to fueling historically, and then some of the differences that you implemented for this training cycle?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big shift for me this year, just to try a totally different fueling approach. I mean, I've done high carbohydrate endurance training and racing in the past. I just hadn't done it at the 100-mile distance before. So I got into doing 100-mile races for the first time back in 2012. And just before that was when I started shifting towards a lower carb approach from a higher carb approach. So it wasn't that I didn't know anything about high carb racing. I certainly had a lot to learn in terms of how that's evolved over the years, because it's changed quite a bit from when I was doing it. And also it's just different when you're running 100 miles versus, training for high school and college track and cross country, stuff like that. Or during the phase of ultra running where I was high carb and doing 50-mile races for the most part. So for me, it was like, it wasn't something where I was looking at it through the lens of, okay, I need to remove carbohydrates altogether and just become something where I'm just going like a strict ketogenic diet by any traditional definition. It was more of I want to reduce carbohydrates to a secondary macronutrient in the context of carbs versus fats. So oftentimes what that would mean would be if I was like in an off season or a low intensity, lower volume phase of the year, I would be quite a bit lower carbohydrate than say I would be when I got into a phase of training where I was working on short intervals and long intervals and getting my volume up near kind of historic averages. I would still be low carb in terms of the split between macros. Carbs would always have been my lowest one, fats my highest one, and protein likely similar or a little bit above carbohydrates depending on how much I was flexing in there. So it was sort of like an approach where I was using carbs as a strategic fuel source at much lower inputs. And I would use that as a way to increase fat oxidation rate to the degree where on race day, then I wouldn't need to fuel with as much carbohydrate. So I would go into the lab and get tested when I would get close to a race at times and just see kind of where those numbers all lined up in terms of the intensity I plan to race for. So usually I would be in a scenario where it would look like at my race intensity for say 100 miles near my PR, I'd probably want somewhere in the neighborhood around 40 grams per hour of carbohydrate. So then on race day, it's not like I was not taking in carbohydrates at all. I was just taking in quite a bit less than what you're typically going to see somebody do for 100 miles running the pace that I would be running or hitting the workload per hour that I would be hitting. Versus now, at Equalizer, I averaged, I think it was 95.6 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So is over 100% higher than what I was doing prior to that. And yeah, so the switch was mostly driven by a balance of curiosity. I didn't have a perspective as to how I would feel differently for 100 miles because I hadn't done one on high carb yet. We're seeing a lot more people navigate the hurdles that were previously present in terms of going with a higher carbohydrate approach, where when I first got into 100-mile racing, it was sort of one of these things where people tended to still be moderate to high carbohydrate in the ultra world versus what I was doing. But there was always this kind of challenge of if you're demanding that fuel source to the degree where you can't replace it, it's just a matter of time before that's going to catch up with you. So then it was sort of a question in my mind of how do I lower that need so I'm not pushing up beyond those thresholds. But I think what we're seeing now through just better like gut training protocols, better nutritional products, and just, more information in terms of how to go about that, people aren't having nearly as hard a time getting up to 100 plus grams of carbohydrate per hour. So to me, part of it was like, okay, well, can I go back and do that successfully this time around to the degree where I don't feel like that's going to be an insurmountable logistical hurdle that would just as likely go sideways as it would go well. And those things kind of got me interested and excited to try it out. So that's when I decided to kind of switch it over to that and give it a shot.
Yeah, the products today make it a lot easier. There's
Mm-hmm.
certain gels, like I think the Science and Sport 40-gram carbohydrate gels. They're just a lot larger too than, your old school goo, which is a much smaller gel. So you can get in a lot more carbohydrate, a lot more logistically easier. Bring us back to 2013 and 2015. Those were years where you set the American record in the 100-mile. 2015, you broke your own PR. Side note, it must be very fun when the AR is also your PR, but
Yeah.
that's what was your fueling like for those races? Because we're talking 10, 12 years ago at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those were For those races, I actually don't think I had lab data. Or for 2015, I did. For 2013, I did not. But it was still pretty similar in terms of what I was targeting, right around that 40 gram per hour number. I sort of arrived to about 40 grams a little bit more intuitively at first. And then when I went into the lab and got tested, it sort of just confirmed what I sort of learned through trial and error, more or less, as to what I suspected was going to be the right amount. But yeah, that's what it was. It was like 40 grams roughly per hour. I'd have to go back and look exactly what I was taking in, but it was some balance of like liquid, carbohydrate. I did a lot fewer gels back then. It was usually the carbohydrates were in some liquid form, and then I would mix in some sort of solid option like a cracker type or pretzel type consistency thing, just to have like a palate variance. I haven't found that to be something I need to do as much of when it's, say 12 hours or less. I think in those scenarios now I've sort of switched to being, all right, I can find a way to get all liquid and gel in from for the target intake, and adding complexity with solids just isn't something that I necessarily need to do. Whereas if I were going for quite a bit longer, then I think that might be helpful from a digestive standpoint, just a palatability standpoint for longer periods of time.
Talk to us a little bit about the gut training aspect to this, because I think the intuitive assumption here is that after years of, sometimes being ketogenic, sometimes, using more of a moderate carbohydrate approach, you might not be your body might not be super receptive to more than a 100% increase in carbohydrate. So was that a steep learning curve for you? How did that work out?
Yeah, that was my biggest fear. My biggest fear going in was, and one of the reasons why I did the Equalizer 12-hour was I wanted to find out. I actually thought going into that race, I was going to end up having to do some troubleshooting. And just in terms of like, okay, I've got this upper GI issue, I'm going to scale back, and then maybe I need to try to catch up, and just kind of switching in and out different things and having different options available versus what I think is going to work going in. So when I switched over in training, since that was a kind of a point of uncertainty, I did do a pretty detailed amount of intra-workout fueling just to sort of get some exposure points to that. So that would be like, if I went out for a long run, I would be targeting somewhere between like 2/3 to 3/4 of what I would like to get up to on race day, which I identified as right around 100 grams per hour. And then just trying to do that as consistent as I could for training sessions that were 2 hours or longer. And then also spotting in some carbohydrate intake without necessarily a specific gram per hour total during like short interval sessions, long interval sessions, or anything that was going to be a little bit higher on the aerobic intensity spectrum. And then also just a kind of making sure I'm getting in enough refined carbohydrate sources in my day-to-day nutrition outside of the workouts too, so that my body wasn't necessarily unfamiliar with like processing and digesting those sort of things. And that sort of served two purposes. One was, we look at carbohydrate sources and they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and from sports products that are super engineered, or like even candy and soda and things like that, all the way to like what people would maybe consider like a more healthy option of like a whole food carbohydrate source, like fruits, like vegetables that have a starch component to it, or even like whole grain breads and things like that. And one thing I found out was when you start getting into a really big training phase, you almost have to be careful about being too drawn to quote unquote healthy options or whole food options, because they also carry quite a bit of fiber and things you have to just work harder to digest. And if you're going to be working out 2 times per day, or in my case, sometimes it'd be 2 runs plus a strength session or something like that, it just ended up being kind of a little bit more problematic to be too overly focused on that. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I can ease some of that digestive stuff by having more refined carbohydrate sources, or at least lower fiber carbohydrate sources in my day-to-day nutrition, to kind of go along with meeting that demand, as well as being just exposed to the actual stuff that I'd be taking in, or something closer to the actual stuff I'd be taking in on race day. So more things like white rice or honey and maple syrup and water-based fruits and things like that are just going to be a little bit lower volume, were stuff that I kind of started gravitating towards. And I think all of that stuff just added up. When I did the equalizer 12-hour, the thing that surprised me most about that event was I didn't really deviate from my strategy at all. And I didn't really have any highs or lows when it came to fueling either. I was basically between 90 and 100 grams per hour from hour 1 to hour 12. And it was almost exactly 2/3 gel, 1/3 liquid carbohydrate. And at no point during that event was I like, okay, I'm getting up to this like pinch point where it's getting a little shaky as to whether this is going to be sustainable or not. That was never a scenario. So when I was looking at wins from Desert Solstice, despite not getting to 100 miles, I did look at the fact that I was able to do a longer than normal run. I'm normally not going to be doing a 5 to 6 hour run in training, not for a flat track ultra anyway, that's of the 100-mile nature. But I kind of had a similar experience as I did at Equalizer. At no point did I find that during that 5-6 hours out there at right around 100 grams per hour, that digestion was contributing to the way I was feeling or giving me any sort of issues from a processing standpoint. So in hindsight, looking back on it, I think there's actually a little bit less work that needed to be done, which was a bit of a surprise to me. I thought, if anything, I'd have to work a little bit harder at it than average because of my lower carb background. But it went that particular shift went about as smooth as possible in terms of predicting what I needed and it being right.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. It sounds like you were very receptive to it. And you did speak to one of my favorite truisms about running, which is the more that you train, the worse your diet gets.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I think this bothers some people, but you listen to someone who is potentially running twice a day with a strength session in there as well. You're kind of doing three individual workouts in one day. There's no way that you can only eat healthy food. And anyone who's running 120 miles a week, or actually, Zach, what was your volume for the most part leading up to a race like this?
Yeah, I mean, my peak week, I think, was 154 miles of running.
Holy moly.
I had a bunch of weeks that got to around 20 hours of total work when you look at just cross training and strength work and things like that. So, yeah, it was a big workload.
Yeah, big workload, and that requires a big diet. You need a lot of
Mm-hmm.
calories, a lot of carbohydrate and protein, and if you were eating the fiber-rich versions of all these healthy, whole, quote unquote natural foods, you would probably have way more GI distress than you'd be hoping for with all those
Mm-hmm.
training sessions.
Yeah, yeah, you end up because the other thing I noticed too was when I was low carb, it was a lot easier for me to just like focus on, say, like two really big meals and maybe some small snacks, because like I could get in a pretty high calorie load at a fairly low volume with that approach, just from like the foods that I ended up kind of preferring or gravitating towards. Whereas with carbohydrate, I found like a lot of times I would get full, like uncomfortably full before I would hit whatever calorie total I was looking to hit in a meal. So I ended up doing a lot more smaller meals versus bigger meals spread out over the course of the day, and that seemed to really kind of help too. Was kind of having those more of those points of eating, even though they weren't as much for any one individual meal. That helped kind of ease with the digestion as well. The other funny thing too is I did like the first, I think it was maybe 12 weeks I spent just kind of figuring out what the inputs were going to be for my diet. And I sort of like overshot the whole foods at first and noticed, okay, that's maybe a little too much of that. I need to scale back and add more refined stuff in. And I found that kind of sweet spot. Then what I found was after I kind of got some consistency with that, I started looking at, okay, well, where are some extra value here in terms of placement of these different types of carbohydrate sources? And one thing that I started doing that I don't know that for sure that this was something that was helpful or not, but I suspect it was, is we talk about gut training and things like that with respect to, okay, I need to try to practice eating while I'm running and getting in these like really refined, easy to process, high carbohydrate food sources. And that's one part of it. But I think there's probably some element of just expanding your stomach's capacity limits, which can be done outside of running, and maybe is preferable to do outside of running because no one wants to go out and do a workout with their stomach full. It's just not as exciting or fun or nearly as comfortable as having like, a well-fueled but relatively empty stomach. So I started thinking of it through the lens of, well, where are the points during the day where I can tolerate a higher volume of food where it's not going to compromise my next training session? And usually what that would end up looking like would be I'd finish my last training session of the day. So my next training input was going to be at earliest the next morning. I would just do like a higher volume meal after that last training session and really challenge my stomach's capacity to hold higher volume food. So I'd make like these, an example this one, I'd make these really big fruit bowls where it'd be like pretty high volume fruit sources for this one to be like apples, pineapples, grapes, maybe pears or something like that, and I just chopped them up and had them in this big bowl, and I just eat that thing, and you'd be stuffed like kind of uncomfortably full after that. But by the time I'd get to my next workout the following day, it was a non-issue. And I do think like when I would do that, then now I'm out there doing my training runs or the race, and the low volume, high carbohydrate inputs there just weren't triggering the whatever signal your body's going to give you when your stomach capacity starts getting to a point where it's a little fuller than maybe it would like to be. And my suspicion is that probably lowered any sensation of like upper GI pressure that maybe would have been there otherwise just from volume capacity limits and things like that.
My hunch is that you can also do this with fluids too,
Mm-hmm.
or at least supplement with fluids, even higher calorie fluids. So you're not just, taking up volume in your stomach, but, you're actually digesting, whether it's milk, whether it's some sort of protein shake that you might have. I've seen David Roche gut train with like a 20-ounce bottle of fluid right after a workout. And I assume the same phenomenon is going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was David was actually kind of my inspiration for that. That and there was always this sort of kind of anecdotal approach in the ultra running community back in the day where, you know, we still get plenty of this because we don't have as good a research with some of these longer events as we do for the kind of Olympic distance stuff. But we've got much more than we did back then. But I remember back in the early days, people would do these long runs where they would intentionally eat like a full meal before they would go out, and then they would practice kind of running at the intensity that they'd be doing for these longer, slow, these efforts just to get comfortable having that full stomach going in. I think David has really taken that initial anecdote and tried to add to it to the degree of, okay, how can we make this more specific to actual race day, but get that same effect? Because you're just not going to go and eat like a full pizza and go out for you're not going to eat a full pizza in the middle of a 100-mile race in most cases, whereas you might do that in training to test your stomach tolerance and things like that. So David's was like, okay, well, how do I do that same thing, but make it something that's maybe a little more specific to race day in terms of the fluids and the actual carbohydrate products you're putting into it. So he's got some really interesting stuff with that.
Yeah, I think this is a helpful way of thinking about making that transition. So, if any listeners here are interested in the higher carb fueling approaches, but you haven't historically done that, all of these strategies from, just getting in more carbohydrate during the day to having a certain percentage of your goal race carb fueling during a long run, and even this sort of kind of stomach extending type of gut training approach, I think all has its place in a certain, maybe a protocol. If you had to give like maybe a protocol or a certain step by step for someone who wants to do what you have done, would you sort of advise the same approach, or would you have a different approach?
Yeah, I think that you can probably I mean I should say there's certainly some individuality here. So I would hesitate to say like, hey, just take what I'm doing and rinse and repeat and expect to get exactly the same experience. I think if you can go, you could maybe go in with like that sort of a structure, but then be very open to making small pivots that are individual to your needs as you start getting feedback from yourself. But I think generally speaking, if you're doing if you're doing if you're doing enough long runs to the degree where you have these opportunities in training to really practice race specific fueling, that's a really good starting point. So I would say like at minimum, someone should probably look at, okay, where are the longest run of my week? That's the one I'm going to really focus on getting some version of what I'm going to do on race day practiced. And the earlier you start, probably the better, because you're just going to amass more reference points from that way on. And depending on how they're structuring their training, if it's like mine, where as you get to the end of it, you start increasing volume to some degree and then also increasing the amount of like longer single sessions that you end up doing, you just end up sort of having built-in opportunities more frequently than you would earlier in the training plan. So one of the things I like about that is it sort of back ends more of that work closer to the race itself too. So when the gut training is probably the most important, that's when I'm doing it the most frequently, because that's when those type of training sessions are the most populated in my training. I would say beyond that, we're looking at a scenario where, depending on how kind of tight your process, or depending on how kind of iffy your stomach has been for you in races past, may drive a little bit of how much extra work you put beyond that. So if it's someone who has a real sensitive stomach and they've always challenged with digestive issues in races, I think they're probably someone who needs to practice that a little bit more and maybe say, all right, I'm going to structure my fueling to be such that I'm practicing this more frequently than just those longer training sessions. Maybe I'm going to do that consistently in even some of my shorter runs and some of my workouts and interval sessions and things like that, and push more of their daily calorie needs into some of their training just to give themselves that additional opportunity to practice and refine that process a bit more. But I do suspect like the average person listening to gut training online, they're probably going to assume they need to do more than they actually need to do. That would be my guess. I think people can probably get away with a little bit less than they maybe assume. And I think part of that's just because a lot of the people who talk about this tend to be, or people who talk about this and the people who get a large signal out to the populace tend to be people who are running these races at a very high workload per hour rate, and they're just targeting higher numbers than the average person's going to need. So I think there is some value to potentially overshooting your actual oxidation rates in terms of carbohydrate need, but that's all going to be relative to your oxidation rates, in my opinion. So if you take someone who is running, it'll take me, for example, my workload for a 100-mile race is going to be between 800 to 1,000 calories per hour. And if I hit my goals on that day, I'm going to be done at that 100 miles in less than 12 hours. Take someone who's going twice as slow as me, they're still going to likely require about the same amount of energy intake during their 100 miles. But if it takes them 24 hours to do it, they can distribute that over 24 hours versus 12. So their intake needs on a per hourly basis, or their workload needs is much lower. So keeping an eye on just where your goals are in terms of your workload per hour on race day can also help you kind of guide how much you're actually taking in during these gut training sessions, and then deciding whether it's something you need to go at or above that to get yourself tolerant of it, or if you're okay, sitting a little bit lower but still practicing it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Zach, because like it will take about the same amount of energy to cover that distance, but someone who's, running 100 miles in 23 hours or double the amount of time than you, their energy needs are just going to be more spread out, like you said. So the all these recommendations of like, get up to 90 grams per hour or 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour, they're all dependent upon a certain intensity. And if that intensity isn't there, we have to dial back the carb intake. And if you try to keep your carb intake high at the lower intensity, that's where I think you run into a lot of those GI distress problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's some pretty simple starting points I think that people can use as reference points as they're trying to put this stuff together for the first time. And the way I look at it is like, if we look at just the population level data, someone who is on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet at their aerobic threshold, so like kind of the top end of zone 2, is going to be burning about a 50-50 split between fats and carbohydrates. So if we look at a 100-mile distance, most people are going to be nowhere above that. Like that's probably a red line in a lot of cases. So if we think of like a 50-50 split at your 100-mile workload as being like the absolute most you would ever need for the average person, then we can start running some numbers. So if it's something where it's like, okay, I'm going to cover roughly 5 miles per hour. Or I mean, when you get to the trails, it gets a little more varied because now you're dealing with intensity at time a lot more than you are at distance. But you can probably run some quick some quick math and some comparators in terms of what your flat moving pace and your hilly mountain kind of pace is, and figure out. So let's say if we use that 5 mile per hour example, that person's going to have a workload of somewhere probably between 5 to 600 calories. So if we think of a 50-50 split of that, we're looking at like 250 to 300 calories, or somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So that sort of covers the maximum oxidation need they would ever have on race day. And I like having some of those data points available, because then you can do less guesswork in terms of starting points, but also less stressing out about whether you're doing it right or not when you get out there on race day. So if I'm working with someone and we think their workload is going to be right around that 50 to 60 gram per hour rate, and we learn from training they can tolerate 70 to 80 grams, and they're out there cruising along for 7 hours on race day at 70 to 80 grams per hour because they're trying to overshoot to try to get some of these potential benefits of going higher carbohydrate than you actually need from an oxidation standpoint. But then they hit a bit of a low point where digestively they're not really tolerating as much, and they can afford to pull back and not worry about it, because they're not really running themselves into the ground the same way that someone would be if they were on the low end or under fueling, and then they hit that same spot where they can't really afford to be taking a break from the fueling at that point because they're already low to behind.
Yeah, that's a really important kind of nuanced take on how to plan your carb fueling. One of the things that you mentioned too was taking in carbohydrate and practicing this while at intensity, doing this during a workout. How does the approach change when you're running faster? Because, I mean, on the one hand, this is when blood is shunted away from the organs. And, this is one of the primary reasons why digesting anything when you're exercising really hard is difficult. But also, there's just even more jostling of the stomach. So the potential for GI distress is almost exponentially higher if you're running 5K pace compared to, an easy low zone 2 sort of an effort. So how do you balance that with practicing your carb intake during a workout?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say with like those type of training sessions where I'm up into the higher end of the aerobic intensity spectrum, so like long intervals at lactate threshold or short intervals at VO2 max or something similar, I'm looking at carbohydrate intake less through the lens of oxidation coverage the way I would for a longer session, and more about if I have some input of carbohydrate, from a perceptual standpoint, my perceived effort's likely going to stay lower. So then I'm just less likely personally to practice gut training during those type of training sessions, because I'm more interested in how do I maintain high quality for these sessions versus trying to shoehorn an additional benefit in and practicing gut training and potentially sabotaging the workout as a result. So I'm just doing less amounts of it, because, in a training session that's a little bit shorter in volume, even if it's a little bit higher intensity, I'm just going to be less likely to deplete liver and muscle glycogen levels to the degree where I have to worry about it the same way I would on a race. But there is a blood sugar component there. So like having small amounts of carbohydrate dropped in over the course of those training sessions, I think can be very valuable in terms of being able to maintain the effort at where you want it to produce the pace you're looking for those type of sessions. So I might just have like a pack of a few gels along the way, or some carbohydrates in a drink source or something like that, so that I'm hitting small amounts of carbohydrate during that session, but not necessarily targeting any sort of number per hour. I probably differ from some people with that. I know other people are going to be using those sort of training sessions to either test their gut or try to hit high amounts of carbohydrate. I just haven't seen a need for that on race day, for me personally, to push that sort of a process yet. So I haven't really done a ton of it.
Yeah, testing your gut during a VO2 max workout
Yeah.
seems like a test that you're going to fail more often than not in
Yeah.
spectacular fashion.
Those are easy enough to fail without the digestive component.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost like you just want exposure to calories, carbohydrate, even the sweetness in your mouth. Like I know for me personally, when I'm doing a VO2 max workout, that kind of a higher intensity session, this is when my stomach is at its most sensitive. So even just tasting a gel at that point could be enough to make me feel a little bit ill. So I think there's value in just getting a little bit of exposure to having a gel or two during a workout like this. Like you said, not because you're trying to get in that 50, 60 grams of carbohydrate. It's just testing your gut just a little bit.
That's a great point because there is some. I think I had David Roche on the podcast a couple months ago, and he mentioned something around that idea where we need to get beyond looking at this as just an oxidative question. That's an important component to it, but there's also like a central nervous system component to this, and there's also just the way your body perceives things from your past experiences all the way to the point of like if you had somebody who was maybe carb phobic for a long period of time for one reason or the other, that they would have this sort of preconceived notion of what that experience was going to be like, and their body may actually respond in similar. If you're that person who has this almost like fearful or negative connotation to what's going to happen when you take in that carbohydrate source, you can rewire that pathway by just giving your mind and your body exposure points to it working successfully or in counter to what your preconceived notions were. So like in a scenario like that, if that person goes out for a short interval session and starts taking in small amounts of carbohydrates and starts kind of connecting to like, oh, when I do that, that flavor and that experience doesn't produce a negative outcome, it produces a a positive outcome, then I think there's a lot of value add in that too, because then when you're out there on the event itself or in training sessions where you are practicing the fueling, I think you may get less of that sort of like repulsion or gag reflex to taking in higher amounts of carbohydrate.
Yeah, and maybe the simplest way of thinking about this is just there are going to be certain flavors that you like and certain flavors that turn your stomach. I know from personal experience, I cannot eat a strawberry cream Gatorade gel. I did that during a marathon, and it did not work out in my favor. But even just kind of finding a flavor that your brain enjoys is part of the problem that you're trying to solve. And when you're on that line of almost trying to get in as much carbohydrate as your body will process during a race situation, I think having that prior experience of just knowing what flavors your body and brain really respond to, that's 20% of the issue right there. Because you could have the right, kind of oxidation perspective on your fueling, but you grab a gel on race day from someone that isn't the right gel that you normally take, and there goes your fueling plan.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the best way to maybe think about this is everyone probably has this experience at some point in their life where they got the stomach flu. And you get the stomach flu and you puke and you throw up. And a lot of times the last thing you ate that you threw up, it's something you look at for a while afterwards. Like it just kind of that upset stomach sensation just kind of manifests itself even when you're done with the flu. So like I remember when I was younger, I got the flu and I had just eaten I think it was like chocolate chip mint ice cream or something like that. And I puked all that up. And I couldn't even look at chocolate chip mint ice cream for probably a year or two after that without kind of almost having this like upset stomach gag reflex sensation appear. So it's like there's nothing about that ice cream a year later that was digestively problematic or that my body couldn't take and utilize as a fuel source. It was just this like psychological thing that occurred because of the experience. So when you think of it through that lens to some degree, it's like, okay, how do I give myself opportunities to have the widest range of experiences that aren't going to feed into some sort of negative thing, but a positive thing? I think that can go a long way too. But yeah, finding the ones that work well for you is always good. Having enough options on race day where you can pivot to different stuff if you need to is good. You probably don't need limitless options, but having more than just one or two is probably going to put you in a better spot for success.
Yeah, your ice cream story is very similar to me really having an aversion to vodka, but that's probably a story for a different podcast. Now, Zach, I think the $1 million question is you have had undoubtedly incredible success at the 100-mile distance with a relatively low carb approach. You're now experimenting with higher carb approaches. you are going to do 100-mile races in the future. So, are you going to continue on this higher carb fueling approach for your next 100-mile ultra, or are you going to strike a little bit of a hybrid or go back to the low carb? What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm trying to keep an open mind about it because I don't want to necessarily get put myself in a position where I go too far to one side or the other. But I think I got enough success out of the approach over the last 6 months that I really want to continue without too much variance, at least for another 6 month training cycle. And some of that I think is just, I talked about this on a recent podcast that I'm going to release where it was just like, I go through the process of how I reflect on a training cycle and pull from the positives and reflect on the negatives and try to kind of set up the next phase of training. And one thing I like to do is if there was something that I spent a lot of time and energy and mental bandwidth really trying to find a process for, and I get confident in it, I sort of want to set that on cruise control so I can free up that mental energy and space to focus on maybe something else that would be useful to focus on to try to make sure I'm not making mistakes that I made the time prior. So I'm sort of pushing the nutrition side of things into that camp for this next training cycle. And that just means I'm not going to really change much then because I don't want to add that additional kind of thought, mental fatigue to that process, at least for another round. And then I'll see how things go race-wise and training-wise. If I get positive results from it, then maybe I'll just kind of keep continuing that. But it's also possible, I think I could get to a point where maybe I look at it through what does this look like in the context of like, say, off season versus early phase training versus ultra marathon peaking phase and things like that, and start pulling a little bit from both. Because I do think there's maybe some value in off season when you're away from racing, pulling back on the carbohydrate intake a little bit. So I could potentially kind of look at a spot on the calendar that would accommodate that down the road. But for now, I'm going to pretty much rinse and repeat what I did for this last 6 week training cycle on the nutrition front and give it a few more reps at some races and hopefully get to fully explore just where the potential benefits or downsides are to it for me personally.
Well, we are very excited to see how it turns out, Zach, especially for this upcoming training cycle. Do you know what you're going to be training for? Do you have a race lined up already?
Yeah, so the race I really like to keep on the calendar when I'm in a spot where I think I can PR is there's an event called 6 Days in the Dome that is done at the Olympic Training Facility in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's actually now up to a 10-day event where it basically it spans a third of the month of June now. So you can kind of pick and choose what you want to do within that, from the full 10-day event where you see how far you can get in 10 days. They've got a 6-day, a 3-day, a 2-day, a 24-hour, a 12-hour, and then there'll be people that do even shorter things within that time frame. And that one lines up really well for me. So that's going to be kind of what I build the entire training cycle around. And I'll definitely do some racing between now and then. But I think one thing I learned from this last training cycle was it's probably better off not to have 100-mile in that mix. So it'll most likely be things that are like 50K to 100K that I use as like highly structured long run practice and things like that leading into to that one in June.
Very exciting. I am definitely going to be following along and cheering for you. Where can folks do exactly that? Follow along and see what you're up to. I know that your podcast, the Human Performance Outliers podcast, is one of the top running podcasts out there. Everyone should check that out for some really interesting conversations on training theory and science. I really love what you're doing there. But is there anywhere else where folks can kind of follow along with your racing too?
Yeah. If they're looking for a one spot to just kind of see what everything I'm up to, my website at zachbitter.com has links to all that stuff, the podcast, social channels, pretty much everything I'm up to. I'm probably most active on Instagram and X. Instagram's just at zachbitter, X is at zbitter. At least last year I did like a full training journal on Substack where I would just post my training week journal every week. I think I'll probably do that again, but I'm thinking about like maybe ways I could do it a little bit differently versus just repurposing essentially what shows up on Strava.
Yeah. Strava has made everyone's training fairly public.
Yeah. So it's like, where's the value here versus somewhere else type of a question. And then there's only so many hours in the day to do all these fun things.
So much running fun. Well, I hope folks check out your podcast and your website. Zach, congrats again on your 100-mile attempt. That was just 10 days ago. And we're all really excited to see what you're up to in 2026.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jason. And I'll have to have you on the podcast to chat about some strength running. I think that'd be a fun topic for my listeners.
Awesome. Let's do it. Thanks, Zach.